Welcome to Planet, People, Mining, Voices at the Crossroads of Mining, Communities, and Sustainability. I'm your host, Allison Koppel. I have over 20 years in this space in 5 mining companies. I then found myself in transition when this podcast emerged through reconnecting with my incredible network, whose insights may be heard as one-off episodes on other platforms, while here they take center stage. If you're also a trailblazer with stories from the field, a mining colleague curious about what these people even do, if you're interested in this field of impactful, motivating work, or from another industry, join us as we celebrate their contributions, demystify their roles, and explore the community and sustainability issues they tackle. And for our Spanish-speaking audience, busca Planet People Mining en Español. Today's episode, Drawing People on Maps, Embedding Social Impact Management, with Sharon Flynn. Sharon's varied background began with the NGO Conservation International, realizing quickly that saving biodiversity meant working with people living within the biodiversity. This work led her to the large engineering construction firm Bechtel, who was building the Camisea project in the Peruvian rainforest. Then, after a few years as a consultant, where she was introduced to mining through auditing Newmont's social performance standards, she joined Rio Tinto with the La Granja project in Peru. Her last corporate role was with OceanaGold, where she was executive vice president of sustainability. Today, Sharon is a board member, advisor, industry fellow at the University of Queensland Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining, and a number of other roles that help companies solve complex external issues. So introduce yourself beyond the few bits I shared in your bio. What are a few major life and work milestones?
I've always kept my hand, in the nonprofit side and then also the corporate side.
I'm trying to think of, when I met you, and I know exactly when I met you at a conference. You were at La Granja, Rio Tinto's project, but I had heard about you. So I was very nervous, honestly, first meeting you. And then you had the keynote speech, I remember, at this conference.
Oh, that was in the SR Chile conference. Yes.
Yes, the Social Responsibility Mining
Right.
conference, exactly that. But you said a quote, and I know I've said it back to you, but I'm going to say it on the podcast because I quote you often, so I thought you should know. You said, my job is to often work with geologists, and they have maps of geology, and I literally draw the people on the maps.
Yes.
And I went, oh my gosh, I'm already so nervous to meet her. And then she says something so brilliant like that. That's exactly my job.
Well, that's not so brilliant. But I have to say I heard of you too, because we were both working in Peru. And I think that we actually were in similar, sustainability, social performance industry meetings together when I was down there working on La Granja. And you were down there working on Antamina at the time, right? Yeah. But one of the things, I was working for Rio Tinto in the corporate social performance team, moved to Peru to take on the portfolio on the La Granja big copper project under development at the time. And I went up to site and I was sitting around with the geologists and they had all their maps out. And I had this sort of moment where I realized there are no signs of human habitation on these maps. They just have no idea what's on the surface. And we were talking to them about some of the local community leaders that were sitting right next to them, who were their employees in the geology department. And these geologists didn't even know the names of the villages that they were doing the exploration under. And that to me is just a great example of the challenge in embedding the concept of what's happening with all those humans on the surface and how to integrate that into how a mining.
What's your current role and why do you view what you're doing now as important?
Well, I am currently working independently. I'm doing strategic work with mining companies who are doing well in social performance and human rights and sustainability and really want to continue to push the agenda. I'm also doing some board work, some corporate board work. I am on the board of an environmental consulting company in Canada, Artara Consultants, that do a lot of work in mine closure, which I think is super important for the industry, and certainly integrating the social aspects into mine closure and thinking about mines as just a transitional use of land. And then I'm also doing nonprofit board work. I've been on the board of CDA Collaborative, which you also know. And they sort of published years ago a seminal book on community engagement, community relations for the mining industry. And they are focused on conflict sensitivity. So they primarily work in the humanitarian and peace building sector, but they're also starting to do some work around climate change and environmental peace building, which I think is an area that everyone should be looking at, and particularly the mining industry.
I think it's interesting how you've created this portfolio of your career right now and still tied to the common thread of communities and their intersection with companies, particularly mining companies. And this has obviously been your thread, as you just described, throughout your career. What's the moment that you realize that this is the thread that you're going on?
When I finished grad school, the UC San Diego International Management and Policy, I really wanted to work in the environmental space. So I started working with Conservation International in Washington, D.C. And that was at the point where the conservation, biodiversity conservation sector had realized that a preservation approach wasn't going to work, that humans needed to be taken into account when it came to setting up protected areas.
Let me just cut you off there. So you drew people on the trees. I'm seeing a thread.
Drew people or actually people lived amongst the trees. And at that point, decisions were being made about new protected areas, particularly in the tropics. And they were made by, northern donors, northern conservationists, local governments, local conservationists, but typically with very little engagement with the communities and people who were actually living in those ecosystems about how they would be affected by the creation of a new protected area. And so to a certain extent, building a mine in someone's backyard has landscape level impacts. And that's what happens when all of a sudden you put a protected area across the place where people live and where they've been deriving their income, either by harvesting products from the forest. And so a lot of the challenges are the same about how space is created to work directly with the people that are going to be affected by those decisions so that they have a say and participation in those decisions. So I'd say that's where the thread started, was in the conservation work. And then I, literally left Conservation International, was hired by Bechtel to work on the Camisea oil and gas project, which was a Shell project, Shell's first commitment to do a oil and gas development in the most sustainable way possible. And also it was, a real learning curve about, how corporations work, how they function. My first mining gig was with Newmont. And that was as a social auditor, to be able to actually understand what the impacts are on the environment and on people.
I think going back to your experience with Bechtel, and Bechtel is an example of a large engineering construction management firm. Throughout my career, I have worked a lot on the other side of the table of a relationship with, the engineering construction firm. And in general, I have found it to be quite challenging. Construction is the most impactful moment for communities, both good and bad. There's jobs, but there's everything else with the noise, the dust, and a number of things in between when, 2,000, 5,000 usually single men come to a rural community.
Mm-hmm.
And you were working on this, I think, way before the industry. And I think the industry is still just starting to understand the need for proactive, good management on community risks in this space, but you were working on this way before that. In that role, what was most misunderstood about your role? When you started to work with your colleagues, that we really have to proactively build relationships with communities, understand how we're impacting them, do things differently. This may change our schedule. This may change our short-term budget. Was that always easily understood?
Yeah, I'd say Bechtel definitely had, when I started working with them, they understood the approach for community relations, and particularly around construction time, because there's so much, noise, dust, and employment opportunities, when a construction project is happening. So that was clear to them. What wasn't as clear as how you put that into a system that can be a methodological approach that can be replicated across projects. Also, their time frame is totally different than the owner. And the owner, which has to sit, say Shell at the time, or whether that's a mining company, they have to sit with the consequences of any relationship that was developed during the construction phase. So they have a long-term perspective on how they want to see relationships built. A contractor, a constructor has a very short time horizon. And unless incentives are put in the contract for that constructor to actually work with the owner to figure out how to integrate into what that owner wants to see in their collaboration with government or communities or their long-term sustainability strategy, then many times the bigger opportunity to leverage construction might be lost. So I think that at the time, certainly, constructors had this idea and this understanding of what needed to be done on the transactional community relations side, but not necessarily the embedding side. And then there was certainly the tension of how owners and contractors, work together and build financial incentives into their deal, so that any approach to community engagement or to local employment or local contractor development is actually aligned between the different companies.
So what do you think, from your perspective, would have made your job easier?
When it first started out, people would think about community engagement as, fiestas, parties, and orphanages. That's what we do. We just scatter cash behind.
Hold on, another Sharon Flynn quote. Another Sharon Flynn quote. Fiestas,
parties,
just in case you didn't get the fiestas.
And orphanages.
Right.
The companies thought, community relations is just throwing cash behind you as you bulldoze through their town. And
hold on, Sharon, don't forget the candy and soccer balls.
Right, exactly. Candy and soccer balls. There you go. Fiestas, parties, orphanages, candies, and soccer balls, right? And there's still many companies out there that see it as that. That approach doesn't at all take into account or even identify the social impacts that the project or the mine is creating across the human and natural landscape. And it's that concept of social impacts. That's what I started out talking about when I started on the path of, the corporate path. And that's still what I talk about. And that still is the challenge, I think, that companies have. Particularly mining companies, they fully know how to anticipate, understand, and think deeply about health and safety impacts. They're getting much, much better about environmental impacts. But when it comes to social impacts, it sort of causes people to pause. And I think just fundamentally, people think they're experts on people because they live in the community and they vote. Therefore, they know governments. And because they've had a life lived, they think that everybody else has that perspective of the same perspective of them about their life lived. This is what they want. And I think that fundamental misunderstanding and ignorance of social impacts, I would say now a big challenge I see in the industry is companies all like to talk about benefits, but they really are hesitant to talk about social risk and negative social impacts. They're totally comfortable talking about health and safety risks to their employees or risks to the environment, but are just learning how to have the language and acceptance to talk about negative social impacts that their operations may create.
I think what you said around there's a big difference, and I'm adding a bit to this, but there's a big difference between I'm from this community and I'm a smart person and I know my community, therefore I have good community relations. And it starts with knowledge of the community. And there is a system and practice and integration that happens because there are specialists on the team who understand the community in a structured way beyond just having lived in the community, because you can live a very different experience than your neighbor and then the person on the other side of town. And to be able to leverage these social sciences and leverage the methodologies to understand the community and then build a structure around how we understand our impact on this community. I absolutely agree with you that that structure, unfortunately, is not always there. Although it is getting built in place, especially around more robust companies. You are one of the people who have had a very senior career in this space. Who are the people that you look up to who have helped you along the way? Who have been your mentors, your sponsors?
First and foremost, the local teams that I've worked with, particularly in Peru, as you well know. Oh, that was such a great communities and social performance team. Peru really has an excellent sector of highly skilled professionals that work in the social performance space, and I learned so much from them. When I first joined Rio, that was in 2007, and I worked in the copper group. And there was this group of senior leaders, men, mainly Australian Brits, who had been working for the company for a long time. And they said, we don't know what you do, but we think it's really important. And so we're going to help you figure out this company, because they knew that I'd worked, with Bechtel and other companies, but hadn't been inside of a mining company. And they just took me under their wing and they showed me, just as you were talking about, what are the systems in place? How do they work? What's a peer review? What's the project development process? Where's the opportunity to insert the social performance aspects, the human rights aspects into that? They were incredible. And I have to say, they really helped to build the opportunities that I had at Rio Tinto. And I'm still in touch with many of them, a few of them, and I'm forever grateful to their mentorship about how to navigate inside of the large mining company. And then there's people who I count as my friends, but one in particular, Deanna Kemp, who leads the Center for Social Responsibility for Mining. You know her. Everyone knows her at the University of Queensland. She is I worked with her first years ago she was also a social auditor at the time for Newmont. That's when I first met her. And she's just always thinking ahead, pushing the industry to be better, thinking deeply about issues. And I, count her as a friend, but as a colleague and an industry peer, I always listen to what she has to say. And if I listen to what she says, then it always has helped me to go, oh, right. I never thought of it that way. Okay. And then, starts me out down a new path of really appreciating a different way of looking at the work that we do. Yeah. And as you well know, the social performance space in the mining sector, it seems like we all know each other, or those of us who have been around for a long time. And I'm always respectful of the great work that everyone does. And we all meet up and go, oh my gosh, because we understand each other. We understand the challenges. We speak the same language. And I think we've all been, at least I've found my colleagues across companies like you and being in touch with you over the years have always just been super supportive. And I really appreciate that.
I will also say about Deanna Kemp, she helps put vocabulary and structure to this work like no one else.
Yes.
And I love what you said about your colleagues at Rio who helped you, who didn't fully understand what you do. And so for those who are listening who don't fully understand what this community team does or the sustainability team does, but trust enough that it is critical and that for you to be successful, you have to learn how to embed it into the organization. Therefore, you have to understand the organization.
Yes. Yeah.
And to be, you want to call that a mentor, a sponsor, or an ally, whatever word you want to attach to that. But to do that act is so helpful for the success of the entire organization.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I love that. And so what advice do you have for others in this field to succeed? There are a number of young professionals who are already in the industry or adjacent industries who see what the communities team does and says, that is very cool work. How do I do that? What advice do you have?
Well, I think once people take on this work, work in the field, spend time on the ground, learning about the interactions between, a company's decisions and the response and effect on communities. Don't look for the silver bullet. You'll be surrounded by people that want a silver bullet. Give me a silver bullet. You cannot address the social and political complexity that every mining company faces with a silver bullet. You've got to be smart and pull together a whole bunch of different information and figure out what are all the different places that you need to be working in order to avoid negative impacts and also contribute. Have courage, have what I call corporate courage. It can become, as you well know, challenging at times to articulate and voice opinions. If you've got a seat at the table, have the courage to speak in a professional, clear way to get your message across. Use stories, because as I've pointed out, they aren't necessarily going to respond to complex social science explanations. I joke that for years I would sit through, and you probably did the same, hours and hours of geologists explaining to me the Andean porphyry over and over again with all sorts of complicated charts. And I would sit through that and try to learn. And then I would get up and start talking about how the communities that we were working with made decisions. And geologists would just go, it's too complicated, and put their hands over their ears and want to leave. And that's what I mean about calling out, the hard scientists to respect the social science. If I can sit through many a lecture on the Andean porphyry, then you can sit through a presentation or a sharing about community decision making, because it will have an impact on the project. And so I think it's important for people doing our work to have that courage to be able to speak up. And don't assume, the other thing I've also seen, don't assume that you don't have a seat at the table. Just take the seat at the table. Many times, don't wait to be invited. Many times you do have a seat at the table. You're just not taking advantage of it, or it never occurred to anyone to invite you there. And then finally, I think that read widely and think broadly. It's really challenging when you're working inside of a company to find the time to read, to collaborate, and take a look at what the academic sector is doing and saying. The anthropologists or the social scientists, there's usually quite a few number of people out there having a good, long, deep, schooled, smart look at the dynamics that are going on around the place where you're trying to work. Take the time to engage with them, to listen to them, to read. That's the only way to keep up with all of that change that's happening in that world outside, that you, if you're working in a company, are responsible for figuring out and bringing back to the company and sharing with them what's going on. Yeah, that would be my advice, at least to start.
I love the corporate courage. Have corporate courage. Yeah, that's a good one. And also to not wait to be invited to the table, or to don't assume that you weren't invited. That oftentimes I found myself that it wasn't really clear what my role was. And because I'm only there to, make a fiesta and give out soccer balls. So why would I be at this geology meeting, real stuff here? And so I realized as I explained, no, I need to see if there's people underneath, on top of these rocks on these maps that you're going to be looking at, or more concretely, exactly how my role intersects with them. And when I put it in plain language, they just look at me like, oh, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Meeting. Like, why are you not at this meeting? Or to your point around the hours and hours of things that I've learned, technical disciplines that I've learned, that, that was the agenda that was put together. And so if we can collaborate on an agenda that really leverages everyone in the room, that there might be a space to need to know that level of technical detail about something. But that in this meeting, what we need to do is how that intersects with the people sitting on top of the rocks. We might have a different conversation. Thank you for joining us. If you like what you heard, please provide a 5-star review, and amplify.